Hello, good evening, and welcome to our weekly Resistance TV slot. Tonight's discussion's about corporate criminals. Judging by the reportage in the mainstream media, though, you'd think that corporate crime's a rarity, but you'd be wrong. Rod Driver's going to argue tonight that we're actually surrounded by big companies committing crime on a daily basis. Rod says the current system's not fit for purpose. It gives rich rewards to executives and shareholders when companies commit serious crimes, and they're hardly ever caught or prosecuted. And when they are, the penalties are usually pretty pathetic. But woe betide a private citizen who commits a crime, particularly if they're a working class citizen. In those circumstances, the lawbreakers feel the full weight of the state's judicial and penal system, neither of which are fit for purpose either, in my opinion. So, Rod, corporate criminals, what's to be done about them?
Hi, Chris. Thanks for that great introduction. Well, we'll come on to what to do about them later in the show. So if I begin by kind of telling you a little bit more about what's really going on, so people get some perspective. So the point is basically that white collar crime is actually an enormous area, but is so badly reported by the press that most people really don't understand the scale of it. So I'm going to start by talking about a small number of kind of famous cases and a little bit of historical stuff, and then we'll expand upon that. So if we go back a few hundred years, we realize that corporate crime is nothing new. So a long time ago, we had the British East India Company. So there was this giant international company that was basically an extension of the British government, and it ruled India. And millions of people died because of famines whilst they were in charge, and they committed many crimes, and they were eventually investigated in the courts by the courts in Britain. And then you jump forward a century or two, and you go to America, and people may have heard of the expression the robber barons. So these were the biggest companies in America. So this was oil, banking, steel, and railroads. And they committed murder, kidnapping, and extortion, all with the consent of the US government. Okay, we'll talk about this relationship between corporate crime and governments a bit more as we go through. So if we jump forward to the present day, most people will be aware that occasionally some crime or wrongdoing or fraud committed by a big company is mentioned in the mainstream press. So a few years ago, Volkswagen, the car company, got a lot of very bad publicity for manipulating their emissions testing. And WikiLeaks, the organization that allows whistleblowers to release information about government and corporate crimes, exposed documents about an oil trading company called Trafigura, which was dumping toxic waste off the Ivory Coast in Africa. And the estimate is that about 100,000 people needed hospital treatment following that toxic dumping. And then people will have heard in the press about the Deepwater Horizon oil explosion, which created immense pollution off the coast of the United States, and people died. And this was all because of cost cutting by executives. And a few people will be aware that the most famous case about 20 years ago was a big American company called Enron. If you've never heard of the Enron case, it's really worth looking up on the internet to understand it in more detail. So Enron was a sort of energy company, but it was also a trading company. And they realized that if they could shut down a power plant for maintenance at the right time at peak demand, then there wouldn't be enough energy or electricity, and prices would go through the roof, and they could make astronomical profits. And there was a major investigation, and this was one of the few occasions when, in fact, the wrongdoing was so extreme that there were investigations in relation to criminal charges and so on. But that's slightly unusual, actually. What we realize when we start looking, though, is that this is much more widespread than people realize. So, in fact, all of the big medicine companies, so the pharmaceutical industry, they have all been fined for fraud. And in fact, their sort of wrongdoing and unethical behavior is so extreme that if we get the chance later in the year, it might be worth doing a whole program about them. But in fact, they devote vast resources to exaggerating the benefits of their medicines and lying about the downsides. And then if you look at other industries, I work with a guy called Andrew Feinstein, who's the world's leading expert on the weapons industry. And he has said he has never come across a weapons deal that is entirely legal. They are all somewhat illegal. So you realize this is happening all over the place. Now, one of the main ways in which companies commit fraud is by price fixing. So a cartel is when companies when they work together, they have agreements, often unofficial agreements, often unwritten agreements, to manipulate the prices of the goods they sell. So the most famous one of these is actually way back in 1928, where the world's biggest 7 oil companies sat down together at a meeting in Scotland and worked out how to divide up all the world's oil resources between them to do price fixing to keep their profits extremely high. If we look more recently, in my research, I came across examples of British Airways and Virgin being investigated for manipulating prices, insurance companies, energy suppliers, mobile phone companies, and even Chris mentioned last week how there were investigations into utility companies because they were making excessive profits through manipulation. And there's a European organization that looks at price fixing in Europe. And I had a look on their website just a couple of months ago. And just in the last few months of 2020, they had issued fines to companies who were involved in price fixing of food packaging, canned vegetables, and car parts. So you realize this is not just a handful of incidents. It's across almost all industries. If you go back over time, industry after industry has been fined for price fixing. And in fact, I came across a very interesting case study that looked at the 3 big American car companies going back a few decades before they had much competition from other international companies. And they actively worked together to block the introduction of safety equipment, so safety glass and safety belts. So thousands of people died and many more thousands of people were severely injured because these companies were so keen to keep their profits high by avoiding introducing safety equipment. So they work together to limit competition. So if we look at a little bit more about how companies are able to get away with these things, we come across a concept which is known as regulatory capture. Now, you don't need to worry about the terminology. Most industries have an organization that's called a regulator who's supposed to be like the policeman for that industry. So if you look, say, at finance, they're supposed to have an organization that's a financial regulator. Well, we all discovered during the 2008 financial crisis that all of the big banks and financial companies had been committing multiple serious frauds. So the financial regulator was not fit for purpose. It was not doing any serious regulation. And various insiders were interviewed and they said, well, we didn't see ourselves as policemen. We saw ourselves as enablers of the industry. And if you actually look more widely, this is documented much better in America, but they have other regulators such as the Environmental Protection Agency or the Food and Drug Administration that are meant to be regulating an industry to stop crimes occurring. But in fact, so many of the people within the regulator come from industry that, again, they end up as enablers. So we have this system called a revolving door where people move backwards and forwards between big business and regulators, which means that regulators are not really attempting to regulate properly. And there have been lots of examples where whistleblowers from these regulators have come forward and said, look, they're not doing their job properly, or companies are committing crimes. And what happens is that instead of acting on what the whistleblowers say, the whistleblowers get sacked. So you start to realize that the system is not really interested in stopping companies doing harm. It is more interested in enabling companies to do what they want to do. Now, we can see this much more clearly if we look at the international situation. So at least in advanced nations, we do have regulators, right? In many poor countries, there are no serious regulators. So we see exploitation and pollution on a vast scale. So the most famous case was back a few decades, Union Carbide and the Bhopal poisonous gas explosion in India, which killed thousands of people. And it's believed people are still suffering from that incident many decades later today. Other people will have seen in the news about Shell Nigeria, where various protesters were murdered by the Nigerian government. Now, what you realize is that Shell Nigeria and the Nigerian government are not separate organizations. They have so many personnel in common that they are basically the same organization. So Shell Nigeria is trying to make corporate profit by accessing oil on somebody else's land, and the government is happy to actually kill people, to execute people in order to pursue the oil and for the company to make profits. And you see similar things in many mining companies. So there's a famous mining company called Freeport, which has a terrible track record in countries like Indonesia, where their security staff murder local people and local protesters, and they do it with impunity. They do it with the backing of the government. Okay, so these are very clear cases of crime. But in fact, there's a whole bigger area where we say, well, hang on a minute. Companies are actively involved in writing the laws. They are actually saying, look, we do this activity, probably in a reasonable society, that would be a crime. We don't want you to call it a crime. So they get the government and the regulators to redraft the laws, and their own company lawyers redraft the laws. So what should be a crime becomes legal. So ordinary people can see that their activities are extremely unethical, but technically they're not breaking any laws. So if you look, say, at clothing manufacturers using suppliers in Bangladesh, again, there was a very famous incident called Rana Plaza, where an enormous building full of subcontractors, full of people working, collapsed. Even though people had warned that the building was unsafe, nobody wanted to do anything about it, and large numbers of people died. And collapsing buildings is not a one-off. It goes on all the time in poor countries. And the point is that companies in advanced nations, they don't want the responsibility of ensuring that workers in other countries are safe. Governments in other countries don't want that responsibility either. So nobody has a responsibility. So there are other famous cases that people will know about. So Nestle was selling powdered milk to mothers in developing countries and trying to claim that it was better than breastfeeding. And Nestle received a great deal of negative publicity for that. And so they changed their strategy. We see Coca-Cola, they've appeared in the mainstream media because they deplete the water supplies. It requires a huge amount of water to make Coca-Cola. Well, that actually means that local farmers can't get the water supply. We see food companies exploiting coffee growers and other food suppliers in developing countries. We've seen the water companies who've taken charge of privatized water supplies in developing countries, then cutting off the poorest people because the water company is not interested in providing water to the poorest people. It's interested in making the biggest profit. So people get sick, they die, because when they get cut off from clean water, they need it and they can't survive. And we see, again, go back to the pharmaceutical industry, some very famous cases that again made it into the mainstream news, where the companies didn't want developing countries to make cheap medicines because it would affect their profits. And so even though there are complex international laws allowing poor countries to make cheap medicines, companies got their governments, this is the British and American and other European governments, to threaten developing countries and say, listen, if you don't do what we want to do when it comes to medicines, then we're going to apply sanctions. And in fact, there's a great case study of tobacco. Now, most people will know of the harm that tobacco has caused, and everybody except the very youngest viewers will be aware there have been major court cases, particularly in America, where we discovered that the tobacco companies had lied under oath for decades about the harm of nicotine and the addictiveness of nicotine, and they had manipulated research data for many decades. Well, so we think that in Britain and America, hey, the problem of tobacco is being solved. You know, people are starting to decrease its use. There's no advertising and so on. But actually, if you start looking in developing countries, the big tobacco companies are advertising to get children addicted to smoking. And the cigarettes in many developing countries have much lower regulatory standards, so they're actually more addictive. They're even worse for young people. And there was a very famous case where Taiwan wanted to make sure that tobacco companies could not advertise their cigarettes. They wanted to keep the problem of the health problem due to smoking as small as possible. And the tobacco companies went to the American government, and the American government threatened the Taiwan government and said, you allow this advertising or we will impose sanctions. So you start to realize it's not about governments, that is advanced governments, being unable to regulate companies. It's about governments in advanced nations actually working with companies to commit some of the most unethical activities. So there's some specific cases there where British Aerospace paid massive bribes to the Saudis to buy weapons from British Aerospace. The police did actually want to investigate this, the Serious Fraud Office. This is highly unusual, right? This type of thing hardly ever gets investigated. But the government, the British government, forced the Serious Fraud Office to back down, and they said they couldn't investigate them. So again, you realize these crimes are committed with the backing of the US government. And in fact, the United Nations tried for 20 years to introduce a global code of conduct to improve the activities of big companies internationally. But there were so many vested interests, so many governments like America, Britain, Europe, and so on, all working against the United Nations, that eventually the UN just gave up. And this has effects elsewhere too. So after the 2008 financial crisis, many European governments wanted stricter banking regulations. Well, it was the British government who were the lead kind of lobbyists trying to push for weak bank regulations throughout Britain and Europe. So the government was actually blocking that. And in future weeks, at some point, we might one day talk about war and war crime by Britain and America. And quite often, nobody talks about really why wars are happening. Well, wars tend to happen for economic purposes. There's some very famous examples. So in 1954, the United Fruit Company controlled large parts of Guatemala. Well, the government of Guatemala wanted to stop the United Fruit Company from exploiting the people of Guatemala. Well, the United Fruit Company didn't like that. So they went to the US government, and the US government actually overthrew the government of Guatemala to allow the United Fruit Company to continue dominating the country. And this is where the term banana republic comes from. It's a country that is dominated by, in this case, a fruit company. And there were other examples when the American government overthrew the leadership of Indonesia in the 1960s. And immediately afterwards, there's a huge meeting where big American companies, General Motors, American Express, sat down with the genocidal dictator who had just taken control of Indonesia and decided how to chop up the Indonesian economy for the benefit of American companies. So that's sort of a very, very, very brief summary. And remember, these are the more famous cases. This is the tip of a very, very big iceberg. And in fact, various regulators have said, look, we're massively underfunded. We don't have the staff to investigate these things properly. The examples that we cite on our website or where we've handed out a fine, this is a tiny fraction of the actions that we would like to investigate, but we just don't have the resources to do it. So a guy called Joel Bakan wrote a book about 20 years ago called The Corporation, and it became a famous film, actually, where he explains that big companies pursuing profit are basically acting like psychopaths. And in fact, he's recently made a sequel, but it hasn't been released worldwide yet. And he says the reason he's made the sequel is that a lot of people think that this corporate wrongdoing stuff that was known about 20 years ago, they think things have got better. There's some quite good propaganda and PR that companies put out to say, hey, yeah, you know, we're nicer, we're not so exploitative, we're not so criminal, right? None of it is true. So if you look at all the things that Joel Bakan talks about, so he talks about failures of democracy, inequality, environmental issues, climate change, species extinction, education and welfare, they're all getting worse. They're at crisis level. So he felt it necessary to make this sequel, and some very interesting interviews with him about the sequel, although, as I say, it hasn't come out yet. So the point is, you've got companies that focus on making profit as their only goal, irrespective of the downsides to everybody else. Now, if you had small companies doing this, maybe that's okay, because they don't really have any power or influence. Once you get very big, powerful companies focusing only on their own profits, irrespective of the downsides, then very bad things start happening. And there's an interesting history to this. In 1886, there was a US legal ruling where the courts used laws that were intended to give rights to freed slaves, and they gave the same rights to corporations. So basically, from that point onwards, companies were treated like people. Now, strangely enough, it's turned out that internationally, companies have more rights than individuals. They can sue governments for potential lost future profits in secret courts. So it's not just that they have more rights. If we look at their responsibilities, as Chris mentioned in the introduction, if they do some serious crime, an individual committing that crime would be sent to jail. When a company commits that crime, we can't send a company to jail. We could shut it down, but governments don't want to do that. So all they do is give them a slap on the wrist. They give them a fine. But this basically means that there are no laws for big companies. The law for individuals is something we have to operate within. Okay, the law for companies is actually just a cost of doing business. They can break the law if they want to, if they feel it will be profitable, even if they get caught. So there's a problem that companies are basically making the laws, and the laws that we have are absolutely inadequate for holding these organizations to account. And they're incredibly big. So if you look at the biggest company in America, Walmart has 2 million employees. That's a huge company. The most profitable was Apple. Last time I looked in 2019, it had profits of $55 billion. You can't imagine how big these companies are and how powerful and influential they are politically. So just to kind of wind it up, to point out there's a great deal of propaganda and PR relating to companies. So we're told all the time, hey, it's okay for big companies to pursue the profit motive. Nobody in the press, in the government, ever makes a distinction between big companies and small companies. The idea that if you apply profit motives to big companies, bad things happen, well, that's never mentioned. So the widespread harm of big companies, that's never mentioned. As Chris mentioned at the beginning, you'll see an occasional mention in the press of one company. It's presented as a bad apple. In fact, it's happening all around us every day. So the question, would the world be better off without such powerful companies? That question is never asked by the press, and it's never asked by the government. But in fact, the answer is very obviously yes, we would be much better off without these powerful organizations pursuing very selfishly, very aggressively, and often very criminally their own profits. Okay, there's lots more I could add, but let's.
Okay, no, that's great. That's really fascinating. Thanks very much indeed for that, Rod. It's a rather depressing summary of the situation, though. Would you say, though, that they are all as bad as one another when they get to a certain size, or are there some good apples? You mentioned the way the media portray as bad apples, where they do occasionally report, but are they all as bad, or are there some decent companies out there, big companies?
I remember when I was first reading The Corporation, so this book and film that came out 20 years ago, and they did talk about an example of a good company. It was like a medium large-ish American company. I think they made carpets. It's not a name that I knew, and I haven't researched it since. But they were saying that, so they were talking to the senior people from that company, and their whole ethos was about not doing harm. It was about making sure the employees were all treated well and with respect and had good working conditions. A bit like if you go back through history to Henry Ford, most famously making the Model T Ford, and he made this point that if you don't pay your employees enough for them to buy your cars, then your business isn't going to be successful. So treating the employees well was an important part of the way he did business. And I think historically there may have been a more general kind of ethical perspective to many companies. Now, I think it's hard to say if you looked at, say, the FTSE 100, the biggest 100 companies in Britain, and said, are there any that are completely ethical? Maybe you could find one or two. So it's very clear there's half a dozen really major industries. I mean, the biggest industries. So finance would be probably the biggest of them all. And we'll do the financial crisis and the financial companies, a completely separate presentation on another week. But an interesting thing came out of that financial crisis, that they interviewed some of the people, the senior people from Goldman Sachs, and they said, well, look, we saw customers or clients as, and the phrase they used was muppets to be ripped off. Well, if you've got a whole banking system that sees its goal as ripping off everybody, I mean, we're talking about everyone in the world, then what is the point of having such a banking system? It makes no sense. And I think this idea of profits and shareholder focus, and a trend in the last few decades for companies to think more and more in the short term about their profits and their share price and so on, has exaggerated the problem that they're behaving more and more unethically. And one of the industries that I talk about quite a lot in my writing is the pharmaceutical industry. And then again, we might talk about that specifically in relation to patents and so on in another week. But
an industry, in my opinion, that is ripe for nationalisation, actually. But anyway.
Well, I agree with you 100%. Once people look at it in detail and they say, what's it doing? They realise it's not fit for purpose. It really is not. And the profit motive causes it to do so many either criminal or certainly unethical things that you've got to start questioning why they're allowed to exist in the first place. So I think the vast majority of big companies are now so focused on short-term returns that they're all doing more and more unethical things. The extent to which any one company can get away with crimes depending on where they operate. So it's only British Aerospace that can pay a $7 billion bribe to the Saudis to get them to buy their weapons. So other companies can't easily do that. But they'll do other things that are fraudulent and so on. So,
and the scandal there, Rod, that you mentioned, of course, is the British government. I'm not sure. I think it was Tony Blair was the Prime Minister, wasn't he, at the time? Intervened to stop the investigation. This absolute disgrace. But
so this is the interesting thing, that actually when you start digging, I've been asked over the years, who do I perceive as the sort of greatest threat to ordinary people? Is it the government or is it big companies? And the question slightly misunderstands how things work. So as a kind of general rule, it's probably always the case that the greatest threat to any individual is their own government. But the problems arise when governments decide to align their kind of political power with the profit motive, with corporate power and with great wealth, instead of working in the interests of the population. And
well, that's been a point that I've been making, Rod, for some time. And having experienced at close quarters the Houses of Parliament, in my opinion, my humble opinion, the vast bulk of them are really agents for the corporate world, for these robber barons that you actually are talking about, and the influence that they have with their huge sort of resources at their disposal in terms of lobbying, etc. It gives them, an undue influence. But it seems to me, Rod, I mean, you mentioned that this has been well, it's got particularly worse, you said, I think, over the last few decades. And isn't it the case, therefore, then, that the cancer really here is neoliberalism that was heralded in, of course, by Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan, the sort of unholy alliance, the axis of evil, you might say, between Reagan and Thatcher. So is it inevitable, what you're saying, with the present capitalist system, all these excesses and abuses that you've identified, is it inevitable or not?
Well, so I think that the word inevitable may be just a tiny bit too strong, but very close. So oddly enough, I've come across, but haven't researched in any detail, people talking about Finland and Sweden. So with Sweden, I came across somebody writing, suggesting that actually the reason Sweden was so successful for many decades, probably more so than most other advanced economists in terms of raising the living standards of the poorest people, was they had a sort of unwritten agreement that the most powerful economic actors, the richest people, would actually just take a step back from politics and wouldn't get involved, provided the politicians kind of left them alone, if that makes sense. And so that the politicians could then focus on looking after the needs of the 99%. And then I was researching, I'd come across something relating to Finland, where somebody said, with a big Finnish company, if they want to set up a subcontractor's operation overseas, then there is a severe obligation on the Finnish company to properly investigate conditions overseas and to employ inspectors to make sure that things are safe and to make sure that working conditions are within certain Finnish standards and so on. So I think there's a number of kind of different layers to this. I think you could create very strict government regulations that would control the worst aspects of companies. But
you've anticipated my next question, Rod, actually, because I was going to say, is the answer then regulation or public ownership of companies when they get to a certain size, or maybe, if not full-scale public ownership, a huge public sector stake in companies when they get over a certain size, like a golden share, perhaps?
So I think there's a number of different ways you could do it, and it's impossible to know with certainty what the outcome would be in any country. I think with the politicians we have at the moment in Britain, unfortunately in the Conservative Party in power in the government, but also in the opposition, I think that they have so little interest in reining in the worst aspects of companies that they're just not interested in doing it. So, for instance, after the 2008 financial crisis, I was doing some research on think tanks. And in think tank after think tank, even the right-wing think tanks, there would be somebody, often a kind of politician, writing some wishy-washy, oh, we need a more ethical capitalism. But there was no specifics, no detail. Nobody actually talked about it seriously in policy-making circles. And so nothing was done. It was very, very vague. And I think that's all that will ever come of the current set of politicians that we have. So my own view is that ultimately, if you want to sort of rescue this system for the long term, then nationalizing all of the biggest, most powerful industries so that the profit motive is removed and they all have to be operated for the benefit of society is the only way to be certain of coming up with a system that will work for everyone and will work in the long term. I think if you have stricter laws, which you could do, you could stop the worst criminal activities, but you'd still have this enormous grey area of unethical activity. And until you stop the companies lobbying the governments and their company lawyers drafting the laws and so on, saying that, oh, well, this thing that probably in a reasonable society should be illegal, we'll just say it's legal, and people can recognize it's unethical, but we won't do anything about it. I think that would just happen a lot. So I'm not convinced that going down this, what some people call a sort of absolutist or a legalist route, would really work. I think companies are so big and so powerful, and they have so much more information than the people who are supposed to regulate them. So nobody really knows what a weapons company is doing in Saudi Arabia, or nobody knows what a mining company is doing in Indonesia. It's incredibly difficult to properly oversee them. I think unless you change the whole mindset of these organizations so they're serving the public and not pursuing profit, I don't think anything will change.
That's a huge challenge, isn't it? As you've said, with our current crop of politicians, and in some ways you can get a little sort of depressed about the prospect really of turning this situation around. But of course, one of the things that we see when politicians who do put their head above the parapet and others on the periphery talk in the terms that you've been talking about, and if they get a platform and start to get a bigger platform, they are absolutely demonized and traduced in the mainstream corporate media, which, as we know, is the mouthpiece for the very powerful vested interests, these powerful forces that you've been talking about. And it's difficult to cut through that. I think we now have, with what we're obviously doing tonight and social media and so on, although, it's the big corporate giants that own that as well, and they're trying to limit our access to those platforms, as you know, and there are attempts being made to create alternative platforms. But ordinary regular people, when I've sort of spoken to people on the doorstep and in the pubs and clubs and whatever else, and when I was younger, and and you talked in the sort of terms that you've been talking, maybe not quite as sophisticatedly as what you've been speaking about, but just those general concepts, even ordinary kind of working class people are fearful about that, and because obviously they read this in the newspaper and they see it's extremism, it's dangerous, it'll bankrupt the country, da-di-da. How do we cut through that, Rod? I mean, I think you've got some ideas, haven't you, about engaging with with teachers and lecturers, etc., to try and get this message out there, because knowledge is power, isn't it? So what would you say about that, Rod?
Yeah, so I'm a great believer that knowledge is power. Although I feel that knowledge is kind of just the first step, if that makes sense. Without the knowledge, you have no power. You have no chance of bringing about change. And it seems to me that if we're really to bring about the sorts of changes that we're going to require in society, we have to get this type of topic talked about much more honestly, much more widely. So I think the obvious places to try to do that would firstly be universities. So in fact, I'm just trying to line up for September when everything reopens, that I'll go and talk to various groups of people in universities. So I always think if there's anybody who's in the audience who's either an academic or a student who might be interested in talking about these things, then they should get in touch with me, and we'll try to find ways to get this out to a much bigger audience. But I think ultimately, the best way to make sure that people are capable of having this type of conversation, because it's not just a conversation about one topic like corporate crime. It goes across the board about all the topics that we're going to be discussing, that we started in the last few weeks, we're going to talk about in the future. That at the moment, people are not really given the basic information necessary to enable them to engage in serious questioning of these topics or serious critical thinking. And I know in schools, occasionally you meet a teacher and they say, well, we are trying to teach critical thinking. But in fact, all the evidence is that if you teach critical thinking as a kind of vague conceptual thing, it actually gets you nowhere. You have to do it in a sort of, you have to give people information relating to the topic you want people to be critical about. So we're actually going to have to start giving more information that is more questioning and more critical to more people. And if we can ever get this type of topic in schools, then I think we could have an amazing transformation in terms of the way people think. And I think there's a real fear at the moment. What you've said about the press is right on the nail, that the system in Britain, and we're going to do a separate thing on the press in a future week, but it's incredibly powerful, it's very sophisticated, and it's very good at shutting down questioning voices very, very fast. You've experienced this, Jeremy Corbyn's experienced this, Russell Brand experienced this, that actually we had a celebrity who was getting a lot of attention, being very critical of the worst aspects of capitalism, and then the media kind of just closed ranks and they very aggressively attacked him. And as you say, they say these are extremist ideas or radical ideas, when in fact, of course, the existing system is an extremist system.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
If people can just take this on board, to recognize that a system where immensely powerful companies do nothing but pursue their own profit irrespective of the crimes and unethical behaviors and the harm they do to everybody else. That's a really insane system. No ordinary person would think, yeah, let's create a system like that. Everyone can actually engage with this. And one of the things about corporate crime as a specific topic is actually even right-wing people do believe in the idea of the law. They believe that the law should be applied. And once you get talking to them about saying, but the law isn't applying to big companies, they're operating outside the law, they're breaking the law all the time, then actually you can engage with a very broad spectrum of the population and get them saying, yeah, actually, this is important, isn't it? And one of the things we talked about in the first week was the extent to which the economic system is rigged to concentrate wealth into the hands of big companies and then ultimately rich people. Much of that happens through this very corrupt corporate system, paying very large amounts to executives and to shareholders, and they're not really earning that money. And if you can actually get people saying, look, this is a lot of criminal activity creating this profit and creating this concentration of wealth, then even some people that you would traditionally perhaps not have aligned yourself with on other issues, you get them saying, well, yes, okay, we do need to make sure the law works in relation to big companies. So there is the opportunity, I think, to have a much broader debate, even into the media, that the concepts we're talking about in terms of corporate crime, where once you start listing all the different crimes, and you look at the FTSE 100 and you see how many of them have committed very, very serious crimes, it's very difficult for journalists to just deny that this is happening. It's difficult for them to smear you as an extremist if you're saying, look at these corporate crimes. So I think there is the possibility that the case is so strong that we could get lots of people involved. And once more people start talking about these things, then you have the chance to get the media involved and to start saying, look, if the media aren't interested, they're the extremists.
I mean, what I used to argue, Rod, when I was doing my Democracy Roadshow, was to talk about common sense socialism, that what we're talking about actually is not extreme in any way, shape or form. It's basic common sense. And indeed, and I've spoken about this on numerous occasions, when Giles Brandreth went looking for secret socialists in Guildford, and you found that lots of people on the street, even in the kind of Tory heartland of Guildford, were actually supportive of the concepts that Jeremy Corbyn was sort of espousing at that time. But just in terms of, you mentioned schools and you mentioned, universities, and clearly they're very, very important institutions. And if we could, get some of this stuff in there and, get young people to start thinking about these things in a critical way, like you say, then that obviously is a beginning, hopefully, of a process and a beginning of the change that's desperately needed. But what about the role of trade unions in terms of political education and empowering their members? Because sometimes the trade unions can be quite conservative and supportive, for example, of the arms industry, the nuclear. And I mean, I had this issue in my own backyard, for example, because in Rolls-Royce, or a small section of Rolls-Royce in Derby, are involved in the propulsion system for the Trident submarines. And when Jeremy was talking about scrapping Trident and, talking about defence diversification, I mean, there was a great deal of fear amongst them. When I spoke to them about it, said, but, this is about not throwing anybody out of work, it's about defence diversification, et cetera, they were kind of very sceptical about that, as were some of the trade union leadership, people like the leader of the GMB, is it Sir Paul Kitchen, who's now retired, and his successor, similarly, were just very sceptical. And indeed, Tim Roach spoke to me and said that, was comparing Jeremy Corbyn to Margaret Thatcher. I mean, it's absurd, in terms of, what, I mean, even if Jeremy was saying we're going to take this money, we're going to put it somewhere else. We're going to throw all of those people who are involved in Trident on the dole. In Derby's case, and indeed, apart from Barrow, I mean, there are very few people in reality. I mean, it's not like the mining industry where, there are whole communities were absolutely destroyed by that. But that wasn't what was being said in any event, actually. And the whole system is kind of falling down around our ears anyway, when you see jobs being offshored to low-wage economies, etc. You look at the number of manufacturing jobs that used to be in this country. I mean, in my own city, where there was, when I left school, about 120,000 people. You could walk in and into into a good, well-paid job in engineering very, very easily in those days. It's not no longer the case anymore. So the system's broken. The system ain't working. So I think finding that correct narrative, that correct messaging, as it were, to ease the fears of the horses who are not frightening the horses, and giving them the as it were, the wherewithal to be able to sort of take on some of these concepts. So just what's your thoughts about the trade unions? Because you didn't mention that as a vehicle for some of these discussions.
Yeah, so I think the trade unions is quite a complex issue. My experience and my wife's experience with her union in relation to lecturers has not really been very positive. That often they can end up being their own sort of worst enemy, and they end up focusing very narrowly, and they have a certain way of doing things that they're very used to. And anything you kind of say, well, let's take a big picture look. Let's try and think more strategically or more holistically. That they find that kind of very, very difficult, I think. And I don't know that there's an easy solution to that. I think we've got to get anyone who's a member of a union trying to talk within the union to their membership and to their kind of senior leaders, saying, let's have bigger debates and more complex discussions, and try and do kind of what I'm trying to do in other places, about saying, we have to stop thinking in very narrow terms, because actually our society is being destroyed. And if unions kind of keep shooting themselves in the foot in the long term, it's going to be bad for everyone. So
not just society, Rod. It's that like the environment is being destroyed, and there was an interesting documentary on Netflix at the moment about the horrors of the fishing industry. Actually, I mean, I'm not speaking just as a vegan, but just in terms of the degradation of the ecosystem, the marine ecosystem, the abuses of human rights, the ruthless, grotesque exploitation of workers, and of course, the quality of the of the products as well, with the fish farming. And I mean, if people haven't seen it, they should watch the program Fishspiracy, because it's quite an eye-opening documentary, actually, and that really typifies the sort of excesses that you were outlining with some of the examples you gave earlier in your presentation, Rod.
Yeah, well, so I haven't actually studied the fishing industry. There's always more industries that I want to research, but you come across examples from every industry you touch upon.
Well, one statistic, Rod, just to cut across you there, that I was really interested in. We're all being told, quite rightly, to be careful about plastic and the way that's being discarded and ending up in the ocean. But 46%, according to this documentary, which has looked into this, 46% of the plastic pollution in the oceans is from the fishing industry, with discarded nets. Yes, apparently, yeah. I mean, it's so they're creating huge devastation in our oceans, and there's nothing. Well, I mean, obviously there's this thing on Netflix, which is great, and that's a mainstream platform, but you don't see it in the news media at all.
No, so that's interesting. So I was not aware of that, and as you say, you wouldn't know that from reading the mainstream press. So what I hope people who are listening are starting to realise that you can't kind of learn about all of these topics just in a kind of hour a week, listening to a couple of people having a chat and so on. It actually requires that people really decide that they want to understand these things inside out, and understanding is going to become part of their lives. And obviously, I understand this is very difficult. A lot of people are working extremely hard and fighting to get by. But one of the things that I've wanted to suggest perhaps to some of your listeners is to say, let's start thinking about what we can do in specific areas that might gradually start to make a difference. And to me, because I study propaganda, and you'll understand when we come to do the topic on the media and propaganda more generally later on, why it is that I'm so critical of the mainstream media. Every time somebody watches mainstream news and current affairs or reads an article in the mainstream press, they understand the world less well. And the only way you will ever really understand the world is to get your news and your current affairs information from other sources that are more critical. And you actually have to wean yourself off newspapers and TV news and current affairs. So I was wondering if we might kind of suggest an experiment for some of your viewers this week, if they feel up to it, to try not to watch current affairs and news on mainstream television, not to read a newspaper this week, but the time you would normally spend doing that, just spend a bit of time trying to research on the internet any topic that you think is really interesting. And in fact, the reason I've written the blogs is because they are intended each to be a very simple beginner's guide to that particular topic to help people understand the key arguments. And then from there, there's further reading and there's references, and they can decide what they're interested in and they can go and understand it better. And then people can come back in next week or the week after, depending on when we have our next session. And if people have tried this for a week or two and they've thought, wow, actually, yeah, suddenly I feel I'm not being brainwashed or bamboozled every time I sit down and watch TV. And over time, if you start doing this regularly, you will eventually come back occasionally. You'll be at a friend's house and you'll see the news or you'll see a newspaper, and you start to realize just how much of the mainstream is propaganda. It is distorted to make you think in a way that is uncritical of the system, the various systems, the military, economic systems, and so on. And
well, I'm looking forward to our session on the media, Rod. That's going to be. We never have enough time actually, because it's absolutely fascinating. We could go on for 2 or 3 hours this evening, but I'm sure we'd probably lose listeners. Rod, I should bring in now, because we've got less than 10 minutes to go. Bring in Lizzie just to sort of see what people who've been watching have been saying, whether they've got any comments or questions that they wanted to put to you in the last 10 minutes. Over to you, Lizzie. You need to unmute yourself, I think.
We still can't hear you, Lizzie.
No, I was muted.
Yeah.
I saw there was some interference on the sound at the beginning. So I realised that I was unmuted at the time. So I muted myself and forgot all about it.
I never noticed, Lizzie, but you were obviously more observant than me. But anyway, what's been the reaction of our viewers this evening?
Well, a lot of people with a lot of reactions, a lot of people saying they don't watch television anymore anyway, about your latest what you said. Allow those that drop out of school to help design the education system. Now, would that be that's if it ain't broke, don't fix it. That's the system is broken, so let's fix it. That's pretty basic stuff, isn't it? That would be hard to achieve.
So I'm not quite sure if those points were related or not. But if we just focus on the phrase, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. So the education system, in my opinion, whilst it's fine for teaching people to read and to write and to do basic maths, in terms of helping young people understand the world, it is completely useless. I mean, absolutely not fit for purpose. And the funny thing is, if you hear people talking about improving the state education system, they will hold up the private education system, which I should point out I loathe, by the way, as the example, as the goal. But in fact, the private education system is really no better in encouraging people to think critically about the world. And in fact, because a lot of the parents of the children who are in the private education sector are so successful, they are the wealthy, they in many cases are the 1% or the 7% whose kids go to private school, they do very well out of the current system. Their parents, they really want their children to be all that critical of the current system. So it's important we don't hold the private system up as the benchmark or as a role model. It's important that we say anyone out there who's a teacher or a student, if we're thinking about the state education system in Britain, it is not fit for purpose because it does not actually teach people about power, about propaganda, which surrounds us every day, about conflicts of interest, about how the world really works. In fact, it doesn't teach anyone about all the most important things about how our society actually functions. You know, and even if you go to university level, the teaching of economics, finance, politics, international relations, I've spoken to lots of academics. 95% of them are teaching a very mainstream, uncritical view of the world. It's a small proportion of lecturers spread throughout Britain, spread throughout America, maybe 5%, depending on the field, that is trying to say the current system actually isn't working. These are the strongest criticisms. And I speak to students, and the students love hearing that critical information. They come out of lectures where they've heard that stuff, and they say, finally, I feel I've learned something. Finally, I feel I've understood something about the world that nobody has taught me for 20 years. My wife does it at university, and she gets the most amazing feedback from some of her students. And it's, there's a real problem. And whilst the government are probably not likely, certainly this government, aren't going to introduce more critical thinking in schools, I think there are probably lots of teachers who individually would like to introduce more critical thinking in schools and would like their students to understand the world better. And I think there is the possibility of beginning a conversation with them and saying, let's start thinking about how we can get children to really understand the world, to be much more engaged and to be much more political as they grow up.
Right. Well, we do have one positive story on your, Chris's suggestion that are there any corporations that are decent? Dan Price, the owner of Gravity Payments, he took a pay cut of $1 million and paid all of his staff $70,000 minimum wage. So that's one. So that's in the entire world.
That sounds very positive. It would be really interesting to actually see a really good analysis of that company and make sure that every aspect of it was ethical. But that's a great sort of positive note. So the point is, actually, there are a small number of billionaires. There's a very famous one in America who's been talking about this for years now. And if his name comes to me, I'll say what it is. It's gone for the second. But in Seattle, he has been active.
Richard Reich.
It's not. Oh no. So he's a kind of former U.S. government kind of advisor and spokesperson. So this is somebody who's not related to government, but he has introduced, or he's been part of a group of people that in Seattle in America introduced a $15 minimum wage, and the system is thriving. So he's very mainstream in terms of his capitalist views, but he's also a believer in the Henry Ford, you've got to pay your employees well. So it might not be entirely ethical, but at least they're getting one part of the system right, which is to make sure that the lowest paid people are well paid.
We've probably got time for one more comment, Lizzie, and then we're going to have to wrap it.
David Davis, the MP, has stood up to challenge the NHS data grab. So you were talking about working across parties, across beliefs systems. Giles Brandreth, Secret Socialist, was another comment. 46% of ocean plastic pollution is from the fishing industry. And did you know that according to HLS, Human Love Solidarity, that but most of the plastic breaks down into microscopic particles and it goes into your body. And apparently the only way that your body can get rid of this accumulation of plastic microscopic particles is by the woman giving birth, and the plastic particles are passed on to the child, and so the woman gets rid of them. And how astounding is that, if that is in fact correct? How astounding is that we are the orchestrators of our own demise?
Well, that's the capitalist system for us, isn't it? Really?
Yeah.
I guess.
But, so I think that the final point you made, I can't engage specifically with things about plastics and in our bodies and so on. I haven't researched any of these areas. The thing about us being the orchestrators of our own demise, I think is incredibly true. And I think if you look at the way inequality in Britain and America, but other advanced nations too, is heading, and it shows no sign of changing direction, then if people do not get off their backsides very soon, we're going to be in a real mess.
Yeah. I think we'll have to wrap it there. Thanks very much indeed, Rod, for another excellent programme this evening. And we look forward to your next one. That's it for tonight's programme, though. So I hope everybody's enjoyed this evening. Next week, we've got Dr. Bob Gill, who's going to be joining us to talk about the latest health bill before Parliament, which, if it isn't stopped, will pave the way to the wholesale privatisation of our National Health Service. So join us then if you can. Thanks for watching tonight, and good night.